With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. All right, we're going to take a break from the news of the day and talk a little history. I love history, and one of our favorites to talk history with is Sarah Stook. She is over in the UK. She writes for the Mallard over yonder, and over here she writes at electionsdaily.com, elections-daily.com. Our friends, a lot of those folks show up on the show, and she's one of them. How you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on again.
Oh, thrilled to have you. I love this topic because it's so fun. We debate education a lot in America lately, the last couple of years, but we don't talk about the education of our leaders. And you've wrote a whole piece on presidential education, especially their college education or lack thereof in quite a few cases here. What got you on this topic to start with?
It's one of those things that just came into my head and I thought, you know what, that might be an interesting piece. Because like you said, we don't really talk a lot about it. I mean, I've never really heard Joe Biden's education ever really come up.
Yeah, it was interesting because I don't know. It's almost like the more modern we've gotten, the less it's mattered. But part of the reasons the less it's mattered is because the recent string of presidents, there's a lot of sameness. There's a lot of Ivy League. There's a lot of higher education. Joe Biden's a little bit of an exception to that. But, you know, you had the Bushes. They're both the Yale, Obama, Ivy League, Bill Clinton, Rhodes Scholar, Ivy League. Is the sameness just kind of dulled it down to where we just take it for granted? Like, okay, the president's going to be some kind of Ivy League, highly educated person now?
Well, I think it matters more now because that education is more accessible. Up until maybe, I'd say probably even the 50s or 60s, education was very much dominated by white men with pockets, you know, women's colleges, historically black universities. But now pretty much anybody can go to college or university. So I think people, you know, they don't see it as impressive because everybody can.
And talk about that, because one thing that I've noticed when I do history with presidents is there's been a big change in presidents. You talk about it in the piece a little bit. You have people like Eisenhower and Grant, the military leaders. It used to be almost always, until really Bill Clinton, you had a president that at least had some kind of passing experience with the military. That's kind of passed away. Now it seems like you almost always have a pretty heavy or at least respectable education career as the basis of a political career. Most of them are lawyers of one stripe or another, or business people of one stripe or another. That's a big cultural shift in the leadership of your country, isn't it?
I think it's, as the times go on, you know, I know it doesn't seem like it, but it's said that the world is safer than it ever has been. Obviously, if you watch the news, you think, how is that possible? But, you know, America, in its early days, it was battling with the British, with the French, with the Mexicans, with the Spanish, with everybody. People led troops. But nowadays, a president can sit behind a desk and talk to his Joint Chiefs. He has that sort of cushion, whereas people like George Washington had to fight on all fronts, both literally and metaphorically. He didn't have the safety and the support and the structure in old America, whereas America's got pretty much a solid military system now.
Yeah, it's interesting talking to Sarah Stook, talking a little history. All right, let's start with the current inhabitants of the White House and one observation lane. The president and vice president, Joe Biden, Delaware and Syracuse. You had some comments about his academic record. And then Vice President Harris, you just mentioned it, women's colleges, historically black college. Howard has long been very important in black education in America through history. But talk about both of their education careers now, that since they're our sitting officers at the moment.
Well, they're the first Democratic ticket since the 80s not to have at least one Ivy League under their belt, which is, you know, pretty interesting. Very much so. Joe Biden basically admitted he wasn't really a scholar. He did okay at college and law school. He's not really academic in the sense you think Obama was. When you think of Obama, you think of a very intelligent guy. And by no means I think Joe Biden isn't book dumb. He's also not academic. And Kamala Harris, obviously, like you said, you went to Howard. When you think of historic black colleges and universities, you do think of probably Howard, Spelman usually first. So I think that leans into a lot of her credentials, advocating for, she plays herself, look, I'm an African American woman. And, when you've gone to a HBCU, that really leans into her image a lot, whether that was a conscious decision by her or she just thought that was the college for her.
Yeah. And then we talked about the Ivy League folks. I found something really interesting in what you wrote too, is we have quite a few college dropouts, or they dropped out of one college, went to another college. Talk about that a little bit, because we don't think of college dropouts, at least in American parlance and in the vernacular. That's usually a derogatory term. We have quite a few presidents that are college dropouts by the definition of the word, don't we?
I mean, William Henry Harrison dropped out of pretty much everything. But then again, he was only president for a month, so I don't think it really matters here nor there. But, presidents, they drop out, they switch. Kennedy was all set to go to Princeton, then decided he was going to go to Harvard, probably because his dad went there and, the whole connections thing. Yeah, some transferred, some weren't interested. LBJ dropped out of law school, though I don't think he particularly needed to, because he already had a pretty successful career. And for these men, I don't think it particularly mattered, because a lot of them were either wealthy or when you could get a law or medical degree without even going to college. So I don't think it really impacted them as much, because they could still get away with it, as it were.
Yeah, talking to Sarah Stook, talking a little presidential education. All right, let's go all the way back to the beginning. The founding fathers, George Washington and these guys. We understand times were different then. There wasn't the university system like now there was. That came along a little bit later. They learned more of a type, I guess you would call it an apprentice system, where you would learn from somebody else and get your education. Just because they didn't go to college, though, the founding fathers, especially Washington, these were very, very what they would call well-read, well-educated men. It just wasn't the college education like we think of now.
Yeah, George Washington, he wasn't, when you think of the founding fathers, especially Thomas Jefferson, he was, very intellectually, absolutely a brilliant man, and those who spoke multiple languages, etc. George Washington, like you said, he wasn't a dumb guy. He wasn't unintelligent, but education was just never in his path. His father died when he was quite young. He had to take over the plantation. He got a sort of a planter's education, so where he may not have been interested in Aristotle and Socrates, but he had more of a practical education, and that is what he needed. He didn't need to be an academic to do what he did, and obviously it clearly worked out pretty well for him. So as long as he was, literate, so obviously not many people at that time were, he was still able to lead the country and lead the army how he did.
Yeah, and the other part of Washington that doesn't get talked about was he was a brilliant businessman. By all accounts, he was probably one of, if not the richest men in America by the time he died. So obviously, whatever education he has with his own wits and cleverness, it clearly worked for him, because he was successful by any measure you want to put to George Washington.
Yeah, he was. His wife, Martha, was also excellent at it. Obviously, at a time where women's education was very limited, she proved herself extremely well, especially after she was widowed for the first time. So clearly, he married a woman who he knew would be an equal partner to him. And I think, that obviously, again, worked out very well for him.
Talking to Sarah Stook. Okay, a fun thing that I think has passed through time, but something we should probably revisit with the mess our education system is, we have quite a few presidents who the whole of their formal education was apprenticeship. There was a time not too long ago, it's actually still on the books, although nobody does it anymore, that being a lawyer and studying the law was an apprenticeship thing. That got in the news with the Kim Kardashian stuff a year or two ago. It's still on the books. But we've had presidents, Van Buren, Fillmore, Lincoln, these guys all learned from an apprenticeship model that's archaic and we don't think about it anymore, but it was foundational to how they rose to the presidency.
I mean, exactly. Lincoln, Van Buren. Lincoln barely had a formal education as it was. Van Buren went to his local school, for example. They didn't have sort of amazing educational opportunities other had, so they went the apprentice route. And they said Abraham Lincoln basically taught himself. He had a brilliant mind, and that probably got them into access to places in a university or college wouldn't. They're able to connect with people in their community, and once they start building up on a practical level, then that's how they get their education. And it worked. Again, you didn't need to be at Harvard or Yale. If you look at Andrew Jackson, who was, he was orphaned during the Revolutionary War. He went through absolute hell, nearly died. You don't need to have that academia behind you. And I think that's definitely more so back then. I think somebody who didn't go to college would probably not be president today. I mean, I could be completely wrong, but when you look at Ron DeSantis, who's leading the Republican pact, Harvard and Yale, you're not going to get somebody who didn't go.
Yeah, true. Sarah Stook joining us. One more item on this that you touched on in the article is a lot of things have changed. Some things have not changed at all. The presidents who did not go to college mostly was because of things like poverty, like access to care. You talked about Washington. There was others that you listed about, their fathers died, so they had to forego college. And this thing, they had to go to work and then they go to college later on. Those are universal themes. It's the same reason people don't get education now, and it still applied to some of our presidents even way back then.
Exactly. Like I said, Lincoln, his family was pretty poor. He was, if he could read and write, obviously he was a very clever man because he basically taught himself. But not every president is blessed to have been a George Washington or Thomas Jefferson born into wealth. However, that's changed. If you look at Bill Clinton, his father died before he was born. They lived in dirt poor Arkansas, and he ended up going to Oxford, Yale, and Georgetown. Obviously, that's because of our current system. But maybe 100, 200 years before, Bill Clinton would not have gone into higher education. He would have probably been maybe an apprentice, but he would not have gone to Yale.
Yeah. And Clinton's an interesting study in and of himself. You ought to just do a whole study just on Bill Clinton. Talking to Sarah Stook, a little presidential history, education of the president's good topic to talk through. We come back with her. We're going to get into the Ivy League versus non-Ivy League and the future of presidential education. More with Sarah Stook on Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Our good friend Sarah Stook. She has written yet another great history piece. All right, this is the eternal debate in American politics: Ivy League versus non-Ivy League. The Ivy League is racking up a lot of wins on the scoreboard as far as presidents go currently. Is there some kind of trend to explain other than just the power and the money? And we understand legacy emissions and things like this, but when you studied it, what's the trend line of why so many Ivy League people hold the presidency?
Again, a lot of it is down to, however, there were some cases that weren't the case. Rutherford B. Hayes went to Harvard. His father died before he was born. The family wasn't, particularly wealthy. Then you look at Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt. There was no way they're not going to go to Harvard. They're Roosevelts. They're rich. They're both very intelligent men. They were going to get in no matter what. The Adams family, natives of Massachusetts from good families. But that's also not, that's an older thing. Bill Clinton, like we discussed, very poor, ended up going to 3 extremely prestigious universities. Barack Obama, double Ivy League. And he came from sort of quite a moderate background, despite being fairly worldly, having lived in Indonesia. But again, if we look a bit closer to home as well, the Bush family, Yale, Harvard, Donald Trump, University of Pennsylvania, another Ivy League. So I think it definitely is about wealth and power. However, I think as times move on, there are more opportunities for non-rich people, scholarships, etc. In the next couple of presidents, we might have a Harvard or Yale graduate who wasn't from extraordinary money.
Talking to Sarah Stook. Okay, but it wasn't, this one kind of surprised me. I guess I knew it. I just never thought of it. It's not just modern people that were Ivy League, although it wasn't called the Ivy League then. John Quincy Adams, one of our earliest presidents, highly educated man, and you counted him as an Ivy League man.
Yeah, he briefly studied in Europe where his father was ambassador, but then he came and he went to Harvard. He was an exceptionally intelligent man, probably one of the greatest Secretary of States. He spoke 7 languages, which is probably more than Jefferson racked up. So I think, obviously, his family being wealthy helped him, but I think he did have an extraordinary mind. And I think most presidents are intelligent. People rag on George Bush Jr. for being a bit interesting in the academic department, but he still went to Harvard and Yale. Maybe it's because of who his dad is, but he still got all right scores, and he actually did better than John Kerry did.
And that was with a drinking problem that he has openly talked about, which is interestingly enough. The non-Ivy League folks, couple surprises in here. I didn't know this. I guess I probably should have. Nixon went to Duke. How did that happen?
Well, he did actually get a scholarship to Harvard, but he couldn't go because his mother and brother needed him back home. And he would he was always so bitter about it. He never got over it. Which, to be fair, you can kind of understand. If you get the opportunity to study at Harvard, you have to turn it down. But yeah, he went to Duke, and then a very clever man. But Duke is still a very good university. Might not be Harvard, but again, it still worked out for him in the end, because I think he was a man who had his mind set on it. And I think, for all his flaws, Nixon was a very determined man. And I think he was actually extremely intelligent. There's a clip going around him talking about Russia, which proved to be very correct.
Yeah. Another one, this is probably one that people would get wrong if you asked them as a trivia question, because Thomas Jefferson is so ingrained into the history and lore of the University of Virginia, but he actually went to William and Mary.
Yes. He did find University of Virginia. So, he couldn't have gone if he hadn't have founded it before his own teen years. Yes, he went to William and Mary, which is still a very prominent college and university in Virginia. So, but again, Jefferson was an extremely brilliant mind from a wealthy family. So again, he could have got away with going to an Ivy League or not going anywhere at all.
Talking to Sarah Stook, our friend who does these great history pieces, talking about presidential education and college. Okay, let's project a little bit. You actually kind of did a rundown of some potential presidential candidates in the future. There's a whole lot of Ivy League on that list, isn't there?
Yeah, I still think there's so much power when, Ron DeSantis is leading the pack for the Republican front, if you don't count Donald Trump. People sort of think he's a bit of an outsider, but he's a double Ivy League. So he's clearly not stupid, and he's clearly a very educated man. But, there's hack of Harvard and Yale's, then you've got some non-Ivy Leagues, like Nikki Haley went to Clemson in South Carolina. It just sort of depends on whether you think of them as a particularly academic person. That's not to say, if you don't go to an Ivy League, you're stupid. But we do tend to associate the Ivies with academia and wealth as well.
Right. And this is a bipartisan thing. We talked about the Republicans. You list the Democrats, some of the named folks going on. Pete Buttigieg, who's currently transportation secretary, Harvard, and a little place called Oxford. I'm assuming that's a nice college somewhere. I'm kidding. My daughter did an overseas program there. I know how prestigious it is. Amy Klobuchar, Yale and University of Chicago, which is a very well-respected school. Julian Castro, Stanford and Harvard. An interesting name on this list, though, for the Democratic Party. I found this really interesting. Stacey Abrams, who's running for governor of Georgia again, going to be a tough candidate. Spielman, Texas, Austin, and Yale. That's an interesting combination.
Yeah, I did look at my main logic here was just to look at sort of the betting and see who's highest, because obviously you don't know who it's going to be next time. Thought I'll put her on the list, and I was genuinely surprised. I didn't think of her as particularly unintelligent, but I just thought, wow, really? I'm saying I didn't expect Yale in there, but good for her, I guess.
Talking to Sarah Stook about presidential and potential presidential. All right, here's you another one. This is kind of like Jefferson. If you ask a quiz question, you probably get it wrong. Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Massachusetts. She is so well known for being at Harvard. She taught there. She was the dean there for years and years and years. Had students like Ted Cruz underneath her. A lot of interesting cross matches there. But she actually went to Houston and Rutgers, which is, of course, the State College of New Jersey, of all places.
Again, what if you think about when Elizabeth Warren was young, would she have necessarily had those opportunities to go to Ivy Leagues? When would it have been, like the 60s, 70s? You wouldn't probably have had women really go. Columbia didn't accept women until 1982. So, she probably could have gone, but Rutgers, again, very respected university. But I think that actually plays well to it, because I think she does give off kind of that establishment vibe as much as she tries not to. So I think that actually would play in her favor, personally.
Yeah, talking to Sarah Stook. Okay, the elephant in the room. Have we seen the last non-college U.S. president?
I would think so, yeah. A lot of Americans don't go to college, and I think it's a society that is actually a lot more of accepting than others, but it's the pathway. It's not necessarily that people maybe wouldn't vote for them, but you get so much more opportunities by going to, especially, Harvard and Yale, you're connecting with people. If you look at the roommates, Al Gore was roommates with Tommy Lee Jones. Really random combinations. You're going to have those connections, meet those people, and that's how you're going to get to the top. Is it fair? I wouldn't say necessarily so. I think, you don't have to go to university or college to make something of yourself, you can still drop out and be absolutely fine.
Yeah, I'm talking to Sarah Stook. All right, one other education trend, and this wasn't in your article, but I'll throw it out at you. The other path besides just education has always been the law and lawyers. Do you see any trend with presidents that have been or were lawyers moving up, as opposed to, it seems like we have kind of a trend going of they studied other things besides the law, business, government administration, these sorts of things. They're still getting those Ivy League educations, just maybe not necessarily in the law.
Yeah, I mean, law's probably quite a good one because you probably have to have a fair knowledge of it to get into politics. Also you can say, depending on your political affiliation, you think, how the heck did these people get into it? But, the Bushes bucked that trend probably because they were more of a business family, as it were. But the people like Nixon and Clinton, who came from middle America, it was a way of, making something of themselves, of using their brains, and it got them out of their homes and doing amazing things. Abraham Lincoln, self-taught from the middle of Illinois and Kentucky to becoming president. Law is definitely the path. You don't see many doctors become president, but you see lawyers.
All right, I'm going to flip this around on you because you are one of our UK friends. That accent ain't just for show. You actually are from over yonder. So let's talk Boris Johnson for a second, because for all his mannerisms and the jokes and the memes and the hair and the goofiness and the scandals and all that stuff, he had a very traditional education path to the prime ministership. It's a different system, but when you look at his resume, you have Eton and you have Oxford. There's also a pretty well-hewn path to the what do you call it, the premiership, I guess, in England. They have kind of the same problem here. You kind of got to get in that rut of higher education to get to the top, don't you?
There's definitely more of a class system in here by quite a long shot. It's incredible. I mean, Oxford's older than the Aztec Empire. These things are entrenched in our system. I don't know anybody who's gone to Oxford or Cambridge apart from maybe one person I met once. So yeah, Boris Johnson, he plays buffoon, but he quotes Greek and Latin like it's nothing. Eton, it's what you expect from a boy of his generation. And Oxford, David Cameron, Oxford, Theresa May, Oxford. Blair and Brown both went to Edinburgh, so they sort of bucked the trend slightly. But Margaret Thatcher went there when women didn't really do that. Churchill, it's just how it is. You're not going to get too many. Even John Major, who came from a council state, he still went to an Oxbridge. So yeah, it's definitely more of a thing here. Keir Starmer, very clever. He went to a good university. When you look at who the favourites are, Rishi Sunak, our Chancellor, he studied at Stanford, I believe, as well as Oxford or Cambridge. So yeah, definitely here more of a class system, but it's kind of easier for us to vote people in because it's via party membership. So the people will vote on it. So whereas you guys, you have your primary systems, etc., it's much more of a membership system here. So we could a lot easier vote in somebody who didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, but unfortunately the top people, especially within the Conservative Party, went to Oxford and Cambridge.
Yeah, talking to Sarah Stook. Okay. Overall, when you look back on this, you studied all the U.S. presidents. What's the thing that really jumped out at you that you learned and went, wow, I did not know that?
I think, people do think of it very much Ivy League, and it's not as profound as one might think. I mean, yes, still definitely dominates the system, but Reagan didn't go to an Ivy League, neither did LBJ, Nixon. A lot of them maybe went to West Point or the Naval Academy. It's not as pronounced as one might expect. I think that's definitely, we're going to probably see more non-Harvard, Yale, etc. in the future. However, like I said, when you look at who's in the running for both Democrats and Republicans, it still remains pretty entrenched, and I'm surprised it is as entrenched as it was. I thought, I was surprised about Ron DeSantis being a double Ivy League. Again, didn't think he was not intelligent by any means, but I'm just surprised because he portrayed himself as an outsider, but went to the two most elite universities in America.
Sarah Stook, I got to ask you to close this because it was just too funny the way you wrote it and the verbiage you used. Tell us about Kennedy's entrance essay to Harvard.
Oh, I love this so much. Obviously, John F. Kennedy went was a very elite family, and even though they were Catholics, which was a bit, taboo at the time, Summers and Hyannis Port, New York, Massachusetts, whatever, he basically wrote his admission and went, I'm rich, my dad went there, I want to be a Harvard man, and got in. So, clearly standards were pretty lax. And I'm pretty sure this trended on Twitter a while ago. I don't think that would fly today. I mean, you could maybe offer to buy a new library, but I don't think Bill Gates' kid could write in and say, yeah, my dad's rich.
And that is also the beginning of the theories on who really wrote Profiles in Courage, but we'll leave that for another day and time. Sarah Stook, you always do great. We love talking these little history things to bring some perspective and take a break from the world. Let folks know where you are on your social media and your writing, and so folks can follow you and keep up to date when you put out this great stuff.
Well, I have an article coming out in the Mallard next Tuesday, March 15th, which you should all remember because it is a very special person's birthday. Questions include, what if the Russian Revolution failed, and what if Bill Clinton was impeached? And I'm also doing a 10-part series because there's a lot of people to get through of First Ladies. The first one should be out by the time this airs, and it goes from Martha Washington all the way up to Elizabeth Monroe. So you'll read all about these amazing women, plus the hostesses, the daughters-in-laws, and the sisters who got through. Yeah, follow me at Sarah _ Stook. And yes.
Oh, yeah. It's Sarah Stook. Great stuff. Always enjoy having you on, my friend. And we will definitely be talking about First Ladies and all that other stuff you're writing about when it comes out. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, man.